Hey, what's up, guys? Continuing the German military books covered by Osprey. This was the new Vanguard series, of course, dealing with the technical, the weapons, like the German Panzers, right? 1914 to 1918. Look at this thing, the A7V. This was the tank the Germans came up with that got into action. Oh, it looks actually. I like the chairs. It's like got nice little comfy chairs, at least for the driver and the commander. And of course, you see like the stools, the chemises, right, for the machine gunners. And of course, in the front you have this cannon. But all kidding aside, it's a fascinating look at. Of course, in the last country to really get on the tank trend was Germany. They didn't really get a lot into action, but the ones they did were it was kind of interesting. Right, contrary to the popular belief, the German army had an active tank program. Right, so it created the A7V side by side with the Beutepanzers, Beutepanzers. That's a booty. No, that's the Panzers they took from the British, and they captured a lot of them. So it's interesting the campaigns they fought in, mostly in the last year of the war, when it's kind of like it kicked up, but it was sort of over. So look how many dudes were in this. There's like they said the crew is supposed to be 18. Can you imagine all these dudes fitting in this thing? You popping out the back. But let me going through the typical. I like that's a cool photo. You got 3 of them. So they're doing a training exercise. But the whole idea of the tank, right? We're basing it off of, if you notice, the only tank that really did what it was made to do were these Mark IV British tanks. I'll show you. This one here. These are the ones where the shape of it, the geometry of it, allowed it to go in and over the trenches. Really, nothing else could. Initially, these were based off tractors. Okay, now it's kind of cool that the Germans are finally coming up with a tank, basing it on the Holt Caterpillar. You know Caterpillar, right? Just like the French tanks, which is you have this chassis here. Pretty much like a tractor. This thing really can't cross the trench. So, and of course, what was cool was this chassis was used for many different roles, not just the tank, right? This the first one, the K-Wagen, right? The all-terrain vehicle. This chassis here. The Germans used a lot of these just for this purpose, right? To bring ammunition and stuff. And you'll see like the different versions of it, but obviously there were many Germans, of course, who were like, "What? Why are we wasting time with this? Making these things? These British tanks aren't really like these wonder weapons they're made out to be." Until they started, it was just the whole mass of them. So anyway, getting to it, you have this chassis here. Oh, this evil symbol. Like the K-Wagens. So they used these, okay? And they had some variants of it, right? They had one here, a Flakpanzer, right? This one is kind of cool. Look at these dudes. Hey, what's up? Yeah. That looks kind of cool. And also there's another, this thing here. What's this? It's a Schützengrabenwagen, like the trench digger. They actually made one. Look at this one. This like I got an office built into it. But you can see that, obviously, the chassis of this thing, based on the Holt Caterpillar, right, is going to be the basis for this weapon. So, and they only made about the A7Vs. They made about, I think, 24 of them. And you look at the cool names they got: Gretchen, Hagen, Nixe, right? Hercules, Wotan. That's right. And like you see the cool, of course, all of the leather boys. Well, because leather is armor, so figures. And of course, you still got like at this point, 1917, they still have these things, at least for the officers in the back. So now, okay, here's an example. Here's the A7V. Look at that. Look at all the dudes in it, and they're right. It's the interior of the tank was extremely hot and noisy, just like the British ones. So they're trying to ride outside whenever possible. And what's cool about it too, I didn't realize, right? There's a nice schematic, the great painted artwork. In terms of the A7V at the end here, sorry, I'm doing this one-handed. Oh boy, this thing. was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, look at this phenotype, man. That guy, that is Alpine. Right? You could take the top off. You could take the box that you see here. You could actually remove it, you know, when it weren't in the front. So it's kind of cool. And it's got a steering wheel, so you don't have those, you know. I mean, the British tanks had like 2 drivers or 3 drivers. So anyway, the A7V was kind of cool looking. You know, kind of like a big box. Look, oh, these are, you could tell that these are French. Oh, look at this. You know, and of course the Australians captured one here. This is actually the only one, right? The only one left in the world. The only surviving A7V is in Australia, somewhere in Queensland. So, of course, the painted artwork, as usual, is just, you know, they give you the side profile, the back. I like this one here, the Mephisto. This one's called Mephisto. And this is, he's stealing your tanks, British. And you see, of course, the Germans also had, of course, the Feldgrau, or this blue, kind of bluish gray. But they had really cool camo patterns, right? And, of course, the skull and crossbones. So, and you can see the Golandwagen is just this thing, obviously, without the armor on it, you know. And the schematics I showed you. Now, the other thing is, they only made about 24 of these A7Vs. Okay, but they had more tanks in their tank corps. But what tanks were they? Well, they captured a lot of these Mark IVs. Okay, a lot of them were knocked out. A lot of them would just stop working. They were mechanically unreliable, and the British crews would just leave them there. Particularly after Cambrai, there was so many tanks that were left behind the lines when the shock troops, the Stahlstruppen, took all this territory back. They had all these tanks. I said, you know, obviously we're having problems with our industry. Let's take their stuff, and that's what they did. So, right, so you have the Cambrai battlefield. You have all these tanks, like hundreds of them. They were taken back to this plant in Charleroi. I guess it's some part of France. So they had a depot, and they started to rebuild these things so they could give them to their tank, you know, to their army. I like this picture. Look at this dude with the cigarette. It's like, hey, yeah, it looks cool. Taken apart, of course, the one that was too damaged. And these Mark IV tanks were now in the German army, and you can see they put a bitchin' camo on them and their Iron Cross. You know, unfortunately, they had the same problems that the British had. A lot of times, these things would just break down, you know. And eventually, you know, one by one, there were a couple they still had. The Freikorps used them on dirty communists in Bavaria and places like that. So that was kind of cool. But look at the cool camo designs they put on them. You know, they literally a land ship, right? You know, and for some reason, I always forget why they started changing the crosses. Maybe these thought these were too much of a target thing for the gunners, but like I said, it was a lot of these tanks. I mean, half these tanks just get abandoned; they just stop working. So now there's the infamous battle where the A7Vs ran into like some Mark IV tanks, and it was a kind of an inconclusive battle. They hit each other. Remember, you have the female tanks or machine gun tanks. They're sort of useless against other tanks, although not by much. You shoot these with enough machine guns, you would get that spalling and whatever. So they have so many of the battles at the end. Ironically, there was one battle where the German, one of these things, took out a couple of the British ones. So and it wasn't an A7V, but for some reason they were really good, and they took out like 3 British tanks. But you get to see over here. Now, you know, they have little side things too. The Whippets. The Whippets were kind of a fast tank. The Germans captured a bunch of these, but they never really used them in combat. Right here, you get these guys are getting ready, and like I said, most of these also broke down. The infantry would outpace them, so they also captured a bunch of these tanks, but they never really used the 2-man tanks, the Renault. Now, of course, there's other armored things, right? What are the first armored fighting vehicles you have, right? Before the tank, right? The armored car. The Germans, once again, they captured a lot of armored cars particularly in the Russian Eastern Front, which most of them were British made on license. But this is one the Germans made, particularly made as an armored car. This was the heaviest armored car you had in that time period. This thing was like, most of the average armored cars were like 4 point something tons. This mother was like 8.6 tons. Even the wheels, it's not even rubber wheels, it's like metal wheels. The Earhart, most of the armored cars though saw more action in the East, okay, and in the urban fighting to come in Germany after the war. Right, so I'll show you right here, like the armored cars in combat, like mostly in the Eastern Front and in the Freikorps battles later. So there's the Earhart gun, but most of the stuff they have, like if you see that cover, that cool book, The Outlaws by Ernst von Salomon, you see one of these Austin British armored cars, but they got them, from the Russians. They got the twin turrets. There's a bunch of other ones too. There's a lot of cool pictures of Freikorps dudes just posing in front of these armored cars with the skull and crossbones, ready for the real war, the war they should have fought against the fucking Reds. But all things aside, other little things. The French tanks, like the Schneider, this monstrosity. Apparently, the German tanks didn't really use French tanks, the tank units, but infantry sometimes would take them. This one was actually one the infantry took to attack the Americans, and it got popped up by the field guns. Also, this weird little kind of silly design. Apparently, the Swedes stole this. Damn Swedes. And they had little tankette designs, right, that never were made. Kind of, looking at the tankette craze to come. And at the same time, these things, the K-Wagen heavy tanks, these things were ridiculously huge. And 2 of them were almost completed, but then they had to take it down. There's a picture of these I'll show you with the Kampfire. This thing was like, okay, we'll make a bigger tank than the one we have. But whatever. It was just interesting to see, the Germans trying to catch up, making a decent tank. When this thing actually, when it came at British infantry, man, they ran for their lives. These things were fairly effective, But like I said, it was sort of preordained, that this was going to end. And look, there's a Gelandwagen. So anyway, really cool. Trying to do what they could with what they had, and it's just a little too late. But wow, they captured a lot of these British tanks, huh? Yeah, that's right. Real quick, I'll probably go over this book at a separate time, but just to give you a little hint of what the Germans were trying to make with that what is that? The K-Wagen, developing the super heavy tank. Mein Gott, this is what the K-Wagen was supposed to look like. The K-Wagen remained very nautical in its arrangement, typical of early land ships, right? The land ironclads, as H.G. Wells called them in his story. His very prescient, one of his many prescient stories. The commander and his gunnery officer observed from his cupola, the bridge, and issued orders to the 2 drivers, who had no vision ports of their own. He issued orders to his battery of guns and machine guns to engage targets. Look at this monster. That would have been interesting. So, and of course, this photo is like from the other one. You get to see sort of an idea how big this thing was, but it was not to be. So anyway, but we'll go over this at some point. But I just wanted to cover the German tanks that you had in the First War.